Hi students, welcome. This is Miss Collins here. I'm going to be going through a set of notes with you called Forming a Government, so that if you missed anything in class, you can get what you need here, and you can fast forward if you left off in a different place or something like that. But I would highly recommend that you do listen to what I'm talking about with these notes, because some of the concepts can be a bit confusing if you're just reading the bullet points. So I highly recommend you listen, and of course ask questions or ask for help if you didn't understand something, you need me to explain it in a different way. So make sure you have your notes open, and I will be going through forming a government. So when we last left off in American history, right, we had the 13 colonies over here, and right, these 13 colonies had been living by themselves for a while, doing their own thing, and after a while wanted to break away from England and form their own country. And we talked all about, why that happened, but wanted to form their own country and did, right? They beat England in war and formed their own country called the United States of America. And when they did that, now the size of our country has increased. So we have not only those 13 colonies, but all of this land over here in the West, all the way up to the Mississippi River, right? So we're here on the east side of the Mississippi River. On the west, we have Spain. And to the north of us, we have Canada, but right, the British are there. And the British are down below us here in the Caribbean as well. So this is the state of America now. I just want you to think about all this new land that's opened up for the Americans to go settle on now. So I just kind of talked about this, right? When we last left off, we went independence, hooray. And one thing we have to think about, though, is a government. And the Americans had actually already started to think about that during the Revolution and had started to create a government called the Articles of Confederation, which we'll get to in a second. But there's going to be some problems with that, and that there'll be issues that need to be addressed and fixed later. And remember too that you can always pause if I move through the slides too fast. You could just pause the video and and write down the information that you need. Okay, so ideas about government. So, right, our Americans are now going to be creating a new government, and where do we start? Right? Do we just think of something off the top of our heads and try and create something that's never been existed? Do we look at the past and get ideas from the past? And that's what the Americans did. They kind of looked and said, "Hey, what has worked in the past? What didn't work?" Right? We've seen what monarchy is like. What other types of government are there, and are those more successful, or could those be better for us? So, right, they were influenced by documents like the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, English Bill of Rights, the Enlightenment. All of these ideas are going to come together to help our founding fathers think about what kind of government will work best for America. And then I give you a good definition here for constitution, what they're going to be creating, right? Constitution is just a document that states like the powers of the government and like the job of the government, right? And so this is a really important document because it defines our government and how it's going to work and the powers of it. And these are things that we need to know as citizens to make sure that our government's following along and doing what it's supposed to be doing. So next here, additionally, ideas about governments. Um, I don't know if you remember this when we talked about the American Revolution, but at one point, the Continental Congress tells the colonies, because they're just colonies, that they are now going to be states because we're going to form our own new country. And first, they want each state to come up with a constitution, right? Just a document saying these are like the laws and rules of our state, and this is like how our state's going to work. And so a bunch of the states had done that. For example, in Virginia, one of the rules of their state was they passed this thing called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom that said no person could be forced to attend a particular church. You were free to worship as you please or not worship as you please, and you did not have to pay a tax to the church either. And while this thing seems like something like, oh yeah, duh, that makes sense. Yeah, it's something that we have today, right? Religious freedom. But if you think back to our Americans, slash, they used to be the colonists, right? Back in England, they weren't free to believe what they wanted to believe, and many of them were treated very poorly because of their beliefs. So this was, you can see why it was so important for them to establish like something like this in the government in Virginia. Additionally, some states, right, it says down here, gave women the right to vote and gave free African Americans the right to vote as well. But soon some of these rights are going to be taken away, and I'll explain like why that's going to happen. Okay, so as I mentioned, our first government was called the Articles of Confederation. And as I said, it was created by the Continental Congress. Remember, that's just made up of people, representatives from the 13 colonies, and they all gathered and it did things like, they're trying to figure out what should we do with our problem with the British, like should we go to war, should we seek peace, all of those things. And so those are some of the things they had been dealing with, but they also were trying to come up with like what should be our first government. So this first government called the Articles of Confederation, here are some of the rules of the government. One, there's only one branch of the government. There's no president, there's no king, there's no like court system. It's just Congress, and and they have very limited power. And each state has only one vote in Congress, right? So you can send a couple of representatives from your state. Like if you're in New York, you might send, 4 or 5 people, but your state only has one vote on any sort of law or anything like that that comes up to be passed. So that means if you're living, in Delaware and maybe you only have a population of 50,000, but in New York you've got, 4 or 5 times that population, it doesn't matter. You all have each state has the same number of votes, and that's one. Congress also had the power to settle conflicts among the states. They could issue money, they could borrow money from other countries, and they could make treaties. And those were all important things that we needed during warfare. Additionally, this one branch could ask the states to send money and send soldiers, right? Think during the American Revolution, but each state could refuse, right? So if they're like, hey, we got George Washington camped out here in Valley Forge, we need some soldiers, we need some supplies. Pennsylvania, can you help out? Pennsylvania could have just said, no, we're good, thanks. So that's definitely a weakness, right, of this government is not being able to get the supplies and troops needed, especially during warfare. I already mentioned that there's no president, no court system, no national court system, but the articles were ratified, meaning like they received official approval in 1781. This is like right as the war is ending, but some of it was in place already as the war was going on. So something good that the articles did do was help divide the land, this new land that we had won during the American Revolution, right? Through the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So both of these are going to deal with that new land and how do we deal with the new land. So let me jump to this map and I'll jump back really quick. So right up here is Ohio River Valley area, and this little map zoomed in on a portion of Ohio, right next to the Ohio River actually, and zoomed in on this little square, and this is how they divided it up. So right, these are like acres. Look, this one area here is 36 miles, so this is a lot of land. So they would divide up the land into little like squares, and they had rules about where the land went to and who got the land, right? So they said 1 square goes to a public school, and I think it said 4 squares go to veterans, so people that had served in the American Revolution, which I think is so awesome, right? Reward the people who helped fight for our country to start. That's an awesome thing to do for veterans, right? Give them some land. So four of these plots are for veterans, and then the rest of the land is open to the public and they can buy it. So that's the way that they decided to divide up the new land. And that was created under the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles did do some good things, right? They did some important things. And yeah, here's where it talks about a school, veterans, and the rest sold to the public. Additionally, this Northwest Ordinance is going to establish a Northwest Territory as states. So Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And so how you would become a state is on this next slide. It says your population has to reach 60,000, and then you have to draft your own constitution for your state, and then you could request to join the Union or join the United States. Okay, so you can't, right? They divided up all the land into territories, but you can't actually apply for statehood until you have those things met, right? You have a high enough population and you've created a constitution. And right, a constitution is just the rules and the laws of like your state. So that's, just agreeing what your rules are going to be of your state. Okay, so those were some good things that the articles did. But next, we're going to get into some drama. So it says foreign and economic problems. So as a new nation, we had a lot of issues with our foe, the British, who we had just beat in the Revolutionary War. One, the British refused to leave some of the forts out in the west that protected valuable land and fur trade routes. So we asked them to leave. They didn't, right? Threatened them, didn't move. So what are you going to do, right? Are we going to go to war over like them refusing to leave these forts? So there's issues with getting the British off of our lands. They don't want to leave. Additionally, the British began to close a bunch of their trading ports to American ships, and they made American merchants pay high tariffs, which are taxes on goods that we import, that we buy, like right from another country. So obviously, the British are very bitter. They lost the war. So, right, they don't want to give up some of the land, and now they're making it really difficult for us to trade with them, and they're making it more expensive for us to trade with them. Additionally, we have some problems with our neighbors, Spain. We had sent Spain has sorry Spain had reached out to us to try to negotiate with our Congress to try and figure out how we were going to share the Mississippi River, because it's a really important river to trade goods on, to move troops, all sorts of things. But our Congress couldn't get the states to agree whether, like, what should we do. The states wouldn't agree, which is not surprising. And so the Spanish just decided to cut off the lower half of the Mississippi and like wouldn't let us move our ships up or down the Mississippi River. So again, you're seeing issues with our Congress. It's not powerful enough to take care of some of the things we needed to take care of. A Rhode Island representative said, "Our federal government is but a name, a mere shadow without substance," right? It doesn't have any, it's just a name. We're calling it a government, but it doesn't really have like the backbone or like anything to actually make it a government. Additionally, states didn't like cooperate with each other. Some of them would tax each other if they wanted to trade goods from state to state. And they only were looking out for their own interests instead of the interests of the whole country, right? They had been so used to like doing their own thing for a long time. Now we're united, and they were like, nah, we still want to charge people from other states. So we're kind of like the disunited states at this point. And something to think about is at this point, right, Britain or England, right, is still our biggest trading partner. And they're just taking advantage of us now as we're recovering from warfare and we're having all this like arguing among our states. Some other issues are the states are having a hard time paying off the war debt because war is expensive. And how do you pay for that is normally through taxes, but our government was very sensitive to the tax issue, as you can probably, assume has to do with our history with Great Britain. So what the states begin to do is start printing large amounts of money, but this causes inflation, where there are increased prices for goods and reduced value of money. I'll explain what that means in a second. And this often leads to a depression, which is a period of low economic activity with a rise in unemployment. Okay, so right, let's say I give you like a $1,000 bill, okay? And only one person in the whole class has it, right? It's super valuable because nobody else has it, just one person. But what if I just start printing out tons and tons and tons of copies of that $1,000 bill? Now everybody can have it. So is it as valuable? No, because all these other people have it. So that's like what inflation is, right? It's where they were just printing all this money, and now it made the money you actually had less valuable because the government's just printing more and more and is like, here's more money, throw it at the problem. And so this always leads to like an economic depression, and it's not good for any country. Okay, so this map is showing what's going on, right? Our trade route on the Mississippi is being blockaded by the Spanish. We're trying to trade goods with Britain, but they're blocking us, right, or taxing us heavily. And if we want to trade down here to the Caribbean area, also, right, a lot of British ports are here, right? A lot of British soldiers are stationed here, and they're not letting us trade there as well. Rough. And then we get to Shays Rebellion. So here's what happens. Massachusetts, right, state of Massachusetts, refused to print some of this worthless paper money. They were tired of just money being printed and it being too worthless. Instead, to raise money to pay off some of the debt, they wanted to collect taxes on some of the land. And so, who is living on most of the land is like farmers. And the farmers had to pay the new taxes, but some of them couldn't pay it. Some of them are really poor, some of them are veterans from the war. And I'm not sure if it's on the next slide. Let me double check. Yeah, here we go. Um, and so if they couldn't pay their taxes, then the local courts would confiscate their land, right? They would take it away and sell it in order to pay the taxes, or they would send the person to prison. So, in August 1786, some farmers began to revolt. They closed down the courts, and so therefore nobody could take away their property. And this guy named Daniel Shays, who was a poor farmer and a veteran of the Revolution, he's the one who's going to lead all these guys. And he's like, yeah, this is unfair. They're taking our land. They're trying to tax us. And they literally shut down the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. And so therefore, like, nothing could get done. They were threatened that they were going to be captured and sentenced to death, but that just got them even more excited and wanted to rebel even more. Um, So in January 1787, there's finally enough troops rounded up to stop this rebellion. So do you see how long this rebellion went? It went from August to January. So they throw many of these guys in prison. 14 of the leaders are actually sentenced to death, but they only actually hang 2 of them. And most were pardoned, including Daniel Shays. But the result of this, the reason why we talk about this rebellion, is because it shows how weak our government was, right? It took them months to shut down a rebellion led by some farmers. And so it's going to convince a lot of people that we need a stronger government, and we need to do something. Because here's the thing, one of the things about after the war, right, all the soldiers just went home and lived their lives again. So we had no like standing army. So if there was a problem like this, who was going to go shut it down? There's no army in place. Everybody went home. They're gone. They went home. There's no like standing army. And so that was an issue that comes up from Articles of Confederation. And there's a little video, and I'll send you a link that you can watch it separately. Okay, so here's something to think about. Now the Americans are ready to create a new government, different from the Articles. What do you think some of the disagreements will be about in the government? Think about that for a second. Okay, hopefully you thought about that. There could be lots of things, right? Think about like representation in the government, representation among the different states, like based off of population. Could be with like standing army, that we need to have a standing army. These could all be things they talk about. Okay, so in February 1787, the Congress decides to, the Confederation Congress, right, Articles of Confederation, the Congress invites each state to send delegates to a convention in Philadelphia. And their goal is to improve the Articles of Confederation, right, just to fix them, maybe use some whiteouts. But what do they end up doing? They actually create a whole new government, to better meet the needs of our nation. And this is where they met, here in Philadelphia. That's why there's this picture back here. So many of the delegates that come to me are well educated. Many of them are war heroes from the American Revolution. And George Washington is actually elected president of the convention. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson couldn't attend. Patrick Henry chose not to attend. And keep in mind, no women, African Americans, Native Americans are going to attend this. So here are some of the things they're going to disagree about. Representation, I mentioned that. Economic concerns, so concerns with printing all this money. Slavery, of course, is going to be a hot topic. And how much power do we give our government without it being too powerful and abusing our rights? Okay. So this little image is showing you some of the key figures from the Constitutional Convention. So Alexander Hamilton was actually nominated by New York to attend, and he's going to argue for a strong national government. James Madison is sent from Virginia, and he is considered the father of the Constitution because he wrote most of it. Roger Sherman from Connecticut wanted to make sure that small states wouldn't be overlooked. George Mason said, hey guys, don't forget a Bill of Rights, and we'll learn about that. Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania said he thought the states should hold more power than the national government. And George Washington, of course you know him, he is going to be the president of the convention, and he's mostly going to keep pretty quiet. Good old George. So here are the two different plans that are proposed at the Constitutional Convention. The Virginia plan is proposed by Edmund Randolph, and he said we needed a new constitution that would give sovereignty or supreme power to the central government, and that we should then have like two different houses within the government, and one is based off of the state's population, and that's how we should do this. And the large states really liked this plan because it gave representation in the government based off of population in the state. So if you had a state with more people in it, you had more representatives in the government. The New Jersey plan is proposed by this guy named William Patterson, and he wanted to have just one house of the government and that each state gets an equal number of votes so everybody has equal participation in the government. So they debate for a month, and then guess what they do? They compromise. That's like the key in American history, compromise. So they compromise, and it's called the Great Compromise. Remember that term. And they decide, okay, we're going to combine both of your plans essentially. So we're going to have one branch of the government. It's going to be called the legislative branch. And in it, there's two different like groups. We call them houses, but there's two different groups. There's the Senate, where every single state gets to send two representatives. And so therefore, every state has equal representation, right? Every state gets to send two, no matter your population. And then the other house, right, the other group is the House of Representatives. And this one is based off of population. So if you have more people in your state, you get more representatives here, right? And so this branch is right where they're going to be like making the laws, proposing laws, voting on laws. And so that's why it's important to have representation, because you want your state to have a say in the laws that are created. Additionally, there's another compromise, and it should be called the extremely messed up compromise, but it's called the 3/5 compromise. Southern states wanted slaves counted in their population so they could have more representation. Because, right, they're Southerners, but there's tons of slaves. And they're like, oh, if we counted the slaves as part of our population, we would get more representation. But do you see how ironic this is? Because do the slaves actually have any voice or say in their government? No. So why would they be counted as population? How about you just free them and then everything's good? Northern states don't like this idea, but again, they agree to compromise, and they say 3/5 of the slaves will count in the state count as population determined representation. So essentially, like a slave counts as like almost like 3/5 of a person in regards to your population. And they're also going to say that we're no longer going to buy slaves from out of the country starting like it's going to end in 1807. After that, you can't buy slaves outside of the country. You could still like trade them within the country, but no more slaves buying from Africa or anywhere else. But something to point out here is slavery is actually never mentioned specifically in the Constitution. The word slavery is never in it. They only say words like the word like free persons or all other persons like who are not free, but they never actually say the word slavery, which is pretty interesting. So here is a painting depicting this first Continental Congress. Here's George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, and they're all meeting and debating and discussing. This should also look familiar to you because this painting is in the hallway. Okay, and there's another video here too about this painting that I'll send to you. Almost done. Oh, maybe we're almost done. Okay, so I wanted to point out a couple of things. So the living constitution. So here, let's talk more about this constitution, this document that these men are going to create to describe how our government works. So there's a big debate, obviously, between having a strong national government and popular sovereignty, or the idea that the political authority belongs to the people. And so, right, how do we make sure people have power, but how do we make sure the government has enough power to like do things that need to be done? So the delegates created something called federalism, which is the sharing of power between like the state governments and then the federal government, or like the national government. So, what's key to know is national laws are the supreme law of the land, and states cannot make laws that contradict federal laws, right? So, if the national government makes a law that says slavery is illegal, okay, so no more slavery, the state of South Carolina then can't make a new law that says, oh, you can have one slave, that's it, right? That contradicts the national law. So national law is always above state law. States cannot make laws that are go against the national law, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And so this document, we're going to dive much more into this in our next notes. But the Constitution that these delegates come up with is going to put the power among three different branches of our government. There's the legislative branch, which is made up of Congress, and their job is to propose and pass laws. And I've already talked about that they're made up of two houses from that Great Compromise. Another branch of the government is called the executive branch, and their job is to make sure the laws happen, to carry out the laws. And this branch includes the president and all the departments that help run the government. So the vice president is in there, and his cabinet, that's what we call them. So, for example, if you've ever heard of the person who is Secretary of State, that means they're head of the State Department, right? They're appointed by the president. They oversee that department. So they oversee like our relations with other countries. That's like what the State Department does. Okay, judicial branch, these are the people that are going to interpret the laws. They also can punish criminals and settle disputes among the states, and they're made up of all the national courts. And at first, the delegates don't really know what to do with the judicial branch, and eventually, as time goes on, the judicial branch will sort of define their own powers as cases are presented to them. You'll see as time goes on. So this little infographic here shows you, right? Constitution is this document that those guys make, right? And it's going to split the power into three different branches. So no one person, no one group of people has all the power. Power is split in our government among three different branches. And this is where we get to our key topic of checks and balances. No one branch can do whatever they want. Okay, that's so important. The president cannot do whatever they want. Members of Congress cannot do whatever they want. The Supreme Court cannot do whatever they want. Every branch oversees another branch in a certain way, and we call these checks and balances. So here's an example. Congress, right, which is part of the legislative branch, has the power to create laws. Okay. But once they make a law, the president gets to read the law and he can choose, or she can choose, to veto or reject the law. Okay. But then the law goes back to Congress and they can actually override the veto if they get 2/3 of the people to actually vote and agree for the law. Okay. But then the Supreme Court can also review the law and they can actually strike it down if they think the law violates the Constitution. So, like I said, as you see, no one branch can do whatever they want. They all oversee each other and check each other. So it's a really smart way to make sure that no one person or group has all the power. So that's the Constitution. In 1787, it's sent to Congress and the states to be ratified. So they have to sign it and agree to follow it and put it into law. And the delegates knew it wasn't perfect, but that's why they created it to be changed. And that's something so powerful about the Constitution is you can change it and it doesn't have to be the way it is forever, right? Eventually, we're going to get rid of slavery. That's going to be a change that we make to the Constitution. But you're going to see two groups emerge, right? As this Constitution is being presented, there's two new groups. There's the anti-federalists who do not like the Constitution, and because they're worried that there's not enough protection for people's rights, and they're worried that the government is going to take away rights from people, and going to become too powerful. So people that are anti-federalists are like Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, people that were very involved in the American Revolution. But also other people are going to be on the other side. The Federalist side are people who support this new like government, and they say this is a great balance of power. And we had to work with people of all sorts of different views, and we all agreed to come to this. And so this is like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. These people support the Constitution and are going to argue for it. So I don't know why there's just one bullet point on this one slide, but, and excuse the bell, class is not really over. So basically, debating is going to occur over this Constitution. There's going to be speeches, there's going to be pamphlets written, and they're all going to be debating, should we have this new government? So, one way it's debated is through this thing called the Federalist Papers. And these are just essays that support the Constitution. They're written anonymously, meaning nobody knows who wrote them. But in reality, we actually know it was Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And these papers they write are written, it's like essays, and they write them, they publish them in newspapers. Eventually, they're put into a book. But people are going to read them and they're going to be like, huh, this is interesting what they say about the Constitution. We only needed 9 states to actually agree to pass the Constitution for it to actually go into effect. So only 9 of the 13 had to actually say, okay, we agree, we'll sign the Constitution, this will be our new government. Only 9 were needed. Delaware became, oh, this might be on my next slide. Cool. Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution, right, to sign it into law. And many states actually held these conventions where regular people could come, like, you and me, commoners, could go and discuss and debate the Constitution. And then in June 1788, the Constitution officially goes into effect. And there's huge debates in the large states, but it took a lot of convincing, but people eventually are going to accept this new government. However, several states would only, and we're right here at the end, guys. Several states would only agree to like accept this new government if we added something on to the Constitution that protected people's rights. Because remember, that was like the big fear: is the government's going to take away all of our rights, right? We're thinking back to the king taking away our rights, and we don't want that to happen again. So some states say they'll only sign the Constitution if you agree to add on a document that will protect individual rights. So the first time the new Congress is going to meet with our new government, right? The first thing on their agenda is like, we need to add on a document that says, here are the rights that people are guaranteed. Okay. And so we add these things, they're called the Bill of Rights. And here, I'll go on to the next slide. They're added as amendments to the Constitution, or like an official change to the Constitution. So, right, you can change the Constitution. It's been changed many times. And the first 10 changes are called the Bill of Rights. There's more than that, right? There's more changes after that, but the first 10 are the Bill of Rights. Because again, like I said, the Constitution was created to be changed. The founding fathers knew, like, times change, our government has to change with the times, otherwise it's not going to last, and what's going to happen? Our country will end. So the Bill of Rights become the first 10 amendments. And this is, like I said, right here, why our country has lasted as long as it has, and why our government has also lasted as long as it has. So we will be doing we're going to learn much more about the Bill of Rights and things like that in our next set of notes. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different branches of government and like, what is the power of the president? What's the power of the Supreme Court? This was just to give you an overview of the founding fathers creating our government and like some of the struggles in creating it. But here are the first 10 changes to the Constitution, right? They called the Bill of Rights. So things like freedom of speech, right to bear arms, the right to speedy and fair trial, no cruel and unusual punishment. These are all things protected by the Bill of Rights. And like I said, we dive much more into these in our next set of notes. And we do a project on the Bill of Rights as well. So hopefully that gave you a good overview of our government, our Constitution, and how it was created and has lasted as long as it has, and all the debates that went into creating our new government. So thanks for sticking with me. Have a nice day.